In the spring of 1992, a courtroom in Rostov-on-Don prepared for a trial unlike any the Soviet Union had ever seen. The defendant would not sit at the defense table like an ordinary man. He would not walk through the doors in handcuffs like other accused criminals. Instead, a steel cage was built, a towering iron structure reinforced and bolted to the floor, surrounded by armed guards. Inside that cage stood a man of 55, former teacher, former factory worker, husband, father. On paper, he was unremarkable, a gray man in a gray suit from a gray country. But the families packing the courtroom knew better. The Soviet state, which had spent years denying that serial killers could even exist in a communist society, finally knew better. Andrei Chikatilo was accused of 52 murders. The prosecution believed the true number was higher. Over 12 years, he had stalked train stations, bus stops, and forest paths. He had lured children with candy and young women with promises of vodka. He had killed them in the woods, treated the victims with extreme brutality, committing acts that deeply shocked investigators. When the judge read the charges, Chikatilo did something that would become routine during the trial. He stood in his cage, gripped the bars, and began to scream, not words, just sound. A high-pitched wailing that filled the courtroom and left seasoned investigators pale. This is the story of the Butcher of Rostov, the most prolific serial killer in Soviet history. A man shaped by famine, war, and trauma, who became the monster his nightmares warned him about. I'm Joker, and tonight we're going behind the mask. To understand what Chikatilo became, you have to understand where he came from. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the village of Yablutchin, in what is now Ukraine. His birth came during one of the most catastrophic events in Soviet history, the Holodomor, a man-made famine engineered by Stalin's policies that killed over 3 million Ukrainians. According to family legend, Stepan had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors during the famine, cannibalized, consumed, turned into food. Whether this story was true or a traumatized mother's invention, it planted something in young Andrei's mind. The world was a place where people ate people, where hunger erased humanity, where your neighbors might kill you for meat. Then came the war. When Chikatilo was 5 years old, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. His father was drafted into the Red Army, captured at the Battle of Kerch, and spent years in a prisoner of war camp. His mother was left alone with young Andrei, and in occupied Ukraine, being alone meant being vulnerable. Chikatilo later claimed that he witnessed something during the occupation that he could never forget. His mother, he said, was violently attacked by a German soldier while he watched, powerless. Psychologists who later examined him believed this moment may have caused severe psychological trauma that affected him throughout his life. The war ended. His father returned, but the damage was done. Chikatilo grew into an awkward, isolated boy. He was severely nearsighted, but refused to wear glasses, squinting at the world through a permanent blur. He was a chronic bedwetter, and his mother beat him for it. He was small, weak, and teased mercilessly by other children. He also struggled with serious personal and psychological difficulties throughout his adolescence and early adulthood, which deepened his isolation. He attempted suicide as a teenager. His mother found him and cut him down. But Chikatilo was intelligent. He studied, worked hard, and eventually found a path that seemed respectable. In 1960, Chikatilo moved to the town of Rodionovo-Nezhitayskaya and began working as a teacher. To the outside world, he appeared to have found his place. He married a woman named Feodosia in 1963, and they had 2 children, a daughter and a son. But in the classroom, something was terribly wrong. Chikatilo worked as a boarding school teacher, and his students noticed things. He behaved inappropriately toward some students, and often created situations where he could be alone with children, especially young girls. Complaints were filed. He was warned. Eventually, he was fired. He moved from school to school, town to town, always finding work because teachers were needed and background checks were minimal in the Soviet system. But the pattern repeated everywhere. Inappropriate behavior. By 1978, at age 42, Chikatilo had been forced out of multiple teaching positions. He was married, a father, employed, but inside, he was festering. His personal frustrations had become overwhelming. His fantasies had darkened beyond anything he could control. He later told investigators, "I tried to resist the urges, but I couldn't suppress them. They consumed me." That year, he bought a small, run-down hut on the outskirts of Shakhty, a mining town near Rostov. It had no running water, no electricity, just a dirt floor and a roof that leaked. He told his wife it was a private retreat, a place to think. It was where he would commit his first murder. On December 22nd, 1978, Chikatilo approached a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zekonova at a bus stop. She was walking home from school. He offered her chewing gum, a rare treat in the Soviet Union, and convinced her to follow him to his shack. What happened next would set the pattern for everything that followed. He attacked her. When he lost control of the situation, he flew into a rage and carried out a violent attack. Investigators later believed the violence itself became the driving force behind his crimes. He dumped her body in the nearby Grishevka River. When she was found, police began an investigation. A suspect was quickly identified, a man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a criminal record. Under interrogation, Kravchenko confessed. He was convicted and executed in 1984 for a murder he didn't commit. Chikatilo had gotten away with it, and the monster had tasted blood. For the next 3 years, he stopped. Later, he would describe this period as a struggle, trying to resist the urges, trying to be normal. But by 1981, the urges won. On September 3rd, 1981, Chikatilo killed again. His victim was Larisa Tkachenko, a 17-year-old girl he met at a bus stop. He lured her to a secluded spot, attempted to attack her, and when he failed, he attacked with a knife. This time was different. He acted with extreme brutality. He later told investigators that he experienced deeply disturbing impulses that shocked investigators. The traumatic stories from his childhood, the famine, and the horrors he had experienced all seemed to converge in those moments of violence. Over the next 3 years, Chikatilo killed at least 30 more people, mostly young women, but also boys. Children as young as 9, runaways, prostitutes, students, anyone vulnerable enough to accept an offer of food, drink, or company from a middle-aged man who seemed harmless. His method was always the same. He would approach victims at train stations, bus depots, or along forest paths. He would lure them into the woods with promises of vodka, money, or simply shelter. Once isolated, he would attack. But here's what made Chikatilo different from almost any serial killer. He did not simply kill. Investigators found that he carried out acts of extreme and unusual brutality that deeply disturbed even experienced officers. Forensic examiners later found that in several cases he had removed the victim's eyes because he said he feared their last sight would be imprinted on his soul. The Soviet police were baffled. They had no experience with serial killers. The very concept was considered a Western phenomenon, incompatible with communist society. Officials repeatedly denied that a serial killer could exist in the USSR, but the bodies kept appearing in forests, in ravines, near train tracks, severely damaged, decomposed, unidentifiable. By 1984, investigators had cataloged over 30 similar murders across the Rostov region. They still had no suspect, but they had a name for the unknown killer, drawn from the location of his earliest known crimes, the Butcher of Rostov. In 1984, Chikatilo made his first mistake. Undercover officers were monitoring train stations, looking for anyone behaving suspiciously. They noticed a middle-aged man repeatedly approaching young women, trying to start conversations. When they stopped him, they searched his bag and found a knife, a length of rope, and other suspicious items.
This knife matches the wounds.
His name was Andrei Chikatilo. He was 50 years old, employed, married, the very picture of normalcy. But he matched witness descriptions. They held him for questioning. This was the moment. They had him. They just didn't know it. But forensic science in the Soviet Union was primitive. The investigators sent blood and biological samples for analysis, hoping to match them to evidence from crime scenes. The results came back type A blood. Biological evidence collected from multiple crime scenes was type AB. They concluded could not be the killer. The problem, the lab had made an error. Chikatilo's blood was type A, but he was a non-secretor, meaning his blood did not appear in other biological evidence collected during the investigation. The evidence later proved to be his. The test was wrong, and because of that error, they let him go. Chikatilo walked out of the police station a free man, and then he killed again, and again, and again. By 1985, the body count had climbed past 40. The investigation had become the largest manhunt in Soviet history, involving hundreds of police officers, thousands of interviews, and millions of man-hours. The pressure was immense. The Soviet government had finally admitted publicly that a serial killer was operating in their midst. Newspapers ran stories, citizens were warned, train stations were watched. But Chikatilo had learned. He became more careful. He varied his hunting ground. He killed in different regions, making it harder for investigators to connect the cases. He stopped approaching victims near his home. He became, in his words, a shadow.
These connections here, they seem to point to something.
Perhaps a pattern we've overlooked until now.
And still the bodies accumulated. In 1985, he killed 6 people. In 1986, 4. In 1987, 3. In 1988, 5. In 1989, 2. In 1990, 8. 12 years. 52 confirmed victims, possibly more. Then, in November 1990, Chikatilo made his last mistake. He had just killed a young woman named Svetlana Korostik in a forest outside Shekty. As he left the woods covered in mud and blood, he stopped at a stream to clean himself. An undercover police officer spotted him, a middle-aged man in a suit, washing blood from his hands in the middle of nowhere. The officer didn't arrest him, but he wrote down a description. And when Korostik's body was found the next week, covered in wounds identical to the Rostov killer's signature, the pieces began to fall into place. Investigators pulled Chikatilo's file. They saw the 1984 arrest, the knife, the rope, They saw that he'd been a teacher, fired multiple times. They saw that he'd lived in every region where bodies had been found. On November 14th, 1990, they put him under surveillance. For 6 days, officers watched Andrei Chikatilo. They saw him approach young women at bus stops. They saw him loiter near train stations. They saw him follow children. They saw everything they needed to see. On November 20th, as he walked through a park, they moved in. He didn't resist. He simply said they'd made a mistake. In his bag, they found a knife and a length of rope. For 10 days, he denied everything. Soviet law required that suspects be released, if not charged, within 10 days, and the investigators had almost nothing. No DNA match, no confession, no direct evidence linking him to any specific murder. On the 9th day, they tried something different. They brought in a psychologist who read Chikatilo, a profile of the killer, a profile created years earlier based on the evidence. The killer, the profile said, would be a middle-aged man who had suffered childhood trauma, who suffered from serious personal and psychological difficulties, who felt powerless and insignificant, whose crimes were driven by a desire for control and power rather than normal motives. Chikatilo listened, and then he began to cry. He asked for a map. Over the next several days, he marked every location where he had killed. He described each crime in disturbing detail, how he approached the victims, and how the attacks took place, revealing actions that deeply shocked investigators. He remembered their names, their ages, the weather on the day they died, what they were wearing, what they said before they died. 52 murders, 12 years, one man. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began in April 1992. It was unlike any legal proceeding in Soviet history. The steel cage was necessary because the courtroom was packed with the families of victims, people who had waited years, sometimes a decade or more, to see the face of the man who destroyed their lives. They screamed, they wept, they lunged at the bars, and Chikatilo performed. He would stand in his cage and scream high-pitched animal wails that silenced the room. He would sing Soviet patriotic songs. He would expose himself to the gallery. He would claim he was insane. He would claim he was innocent. He would claim he was a victim of conspiracy. The psychologists who examined him found him to be fully sane, legally responsible for his actions. He knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He did it anyway.
In the name of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the court finds the defendant guilty as charged.
On October 15th, 1992, the verdict was read guilty on 52 counts of murder. The judge called it the only sentence that he deserves, death. Chikatilo stood in his cage and listened without expression. Then, as the guards approached to lead him away, he began to sing. He spent 14 months on death row in a special cell reserved for the Soviet Union's most dangerous criminals. He wrote letters. He complained about the food. He asked for his family to visit. He seemed in those final months almost ordinary again. On February 14th, 1994, Valentine's Day, guards came to his cell. They led him to an execution room, a single shot to the back of the head. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. No headstone, no marker, no mourners. Andrei Chikatilo was gone, but the questions he raised remain. How does a child who lived through famine and war become a monster who consumes his victims? How does a system that denies the existence of evil fail to see it standing in plain sight? How many other killers in how many other countries are still out there, ordinary men living ordinary lives, hiding extraordinary darkness. Chikatilo's victims ranged in age from 9 to 45. They were runaways. And students, factory workers and prostitutes, boys and girls, men and women. They had one thing in common. They were vulnerable, and he exploited that vulnerability. Their names are recorded in court documents. Their families still carry the weight of what happened. Their graves, unlike his, are marked. Next week, we're exploring another case from the dark side of human nature. The story of a nurse who may have killed more people than any serial killer in American history. Hundreds of victims, decades undetected, and a system that failed to stop him. If this story affected you, and I know it affected me, drop a comment, share your thoughts, and please check on the vulnerable people in your life. The ones who are easy to overlook. The ones who might need someone to notice they're gone. I'm Joker, and this has been Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov.